Hi, everybody. We're going to get started here. Thank you for coming out this evening. I'm sure you're going to enjoy this conversation with Michael Weinreb, who is here to talk about his new book, Season of Saturdays. This event is sponsored by the John Curley Center for Sports Journalism. The center is part of a campus-wide colloquium on sports and society. Throughout this year, sports-interested faculty are cross-promoting speaker appearances so we can all learn together about the sports we love. Our next speaker in that series is sports historian David Zhang, who on November 13th will be talking about Happy Valley and the Paterno era, as I'm sure we will be tonight for a little bit. A word about format. In a moment here, I'm going to turn the podium over to Michael, and when he's finished, he'll take a few questions from me, and then we'll open it up to the audience, giving students the first shot at asking questions. Please remember to keep your questions and refrain from personal statements. Now to our guest, who is well familiar with this campus and State College. Michael grew up in State College and is a Penn Stater, class of '94. He's written for many, if not all, of the top sports publications in his career, and he's now the author of 3 books, including Kings of New York, an award-winning account of young chess players in Brooklyn, and, as I just mentioned, his new book, Season of Saturdays. It reflects on particular games over the years and their larger meaning, both to us as fans and to the sport as a whole. He's got a lot to say about football and about Penn State, and I'd like you to welcome him, Michael Weinreb.
All right, how's that? Everybody hear me? Yeah. Thank you all for coming out, I really appreciate it. Thanks to John and everybody at Penn State for having me, Steve Sansel. It's obviously very cool to be back here. This is where I grew up. Moved here when I was 5 years old, as I'm about to tell you a little bit about. This is where I kind of picked up my college football Jones, so to speak. So I think there's a lot of Penn State and State College in this book. I think part of the reason that I wanted to write this book in the first place goes back to everything that's happened here in the last few years, and how difficult it's been for this community. And there was a time when the Sandusky story broke, when I wound up writing a bunch of pieces for national media outlets, mostly for this website called Grantland, which is part of ESPN. I found myself in this weird position of trying to explain to people why a lot of us care about college football, because there's a world outside of State College, believe it or not, especially on the East Coast, where people don't understand college football. I don't want to say it upsets me, but it's a little strange to, when you grow up with this thing, you think, well, everybody understands what this is about, but they really don't. And so that was kind of the impetus for writing this book. It was to go back through the history of the sport and to examine it, partly for my own purposes and partly to use this book both as sort of a celebration of college football and what's great about it, and also as an explainer to people who maybe don't understand what it's about. And so I was just going to read a little bit of the preface, because I think that sort of explains what the book is about. And in fact, I think I just explained what the preface is about. So probably as I'm reading, you're going to be like, well, you just said what that was about. But anyway, it's very short, and whenever I go to readings, I'm always like, I hope the people who are actually reading the book keep that part of it short. So I'm going to keep that part of it very short. Because it's a strange experience to hear people reading from their own book, and it's a strange experience to read from your own book, because I find that I can go through the paragraphs and the sentences, and I'll be like, well, this word is wrong here. This word should be somewhere else, So that's what will be going on in my head as I read these couple of pages. But you can just listen or not listen or zone out, whatever you want to do. So anyway, this is the preface. So maybe you already understand Maybe you are 9 years old and your father takes you to a college football game. You reside in the vicinity of a sprawling state university. The stadium looms on the outskirts of campus, a clunky leviathan of exposed steel beams and concrete pillars, surrounded by freshman dormitories and parking lots and acres of muddy agricultural pasture land. The roads are narrow, the traffic is suffocating, and the tailgates go on for miles, tethered to recreational vehicles and trailers and pickup trucks. Everything is so huge. Even the air seems weighted down with smells, charred meat and churned up dirt and manure of varied origins. You pass into the stadium through Gate E, and the ramps are too narrow and the people too thick, both individually, because this is rural America, and collectively, because the game is a sellout. And you stand there and you wait for the arteries to clear, both figuratively and literally, and every so often, you hear adults buzzed on cheap Pilsner bellow like corralled cattle to pass the time. Maybe all of this rings familiar to you. Maybe this was your childhood too. For me, it goes back to 1982, when primetime college football was not yet a regular thing, packaged by cable television into a commodified national experience. For me, it was Nebraska at Penn State, a matchup of top 10 programs in front of 85,000 people. The first game in the history of this particular stadium that required lights. The lights were portable, mounted on trucks, and given to frequent short-circuiting. The home team led 14-0 early, and then they trailed 24-21 late in the fourth quarter, and I could not see most of what happened after that, because I was too small, and everyone around me was standing, and I was engulfed in a thicket of down jackets and cigar smoke and pocket radio antennas, and the voice of a guy named Steve was critiquing the play calling. At that point, my memory blends with the television replays, and because I tend to recall my childhood in snapshots, I have retained this photographic image of the stadium clock showing 1 minute 18 seconds remaining in the fourth quarter. And in conjunction with this image, I recall trying to count 78 seconds in my head during the commercial timeout, as Penn State awaited the kickoff for the last drive of the game, as if I might somehow be able to slow the progress of time by deconstructing it inside my own head. There was a throw to the sideline to a Penn State tight end who was clearly out of bounds, but was ruled inbounds, for reasons that either defy explanation or raise suspicion, depending on one's perspective. There was a throw to the end zone to a klutzy tight end whose nickname was actually Stonehands, who cradled the pass in his arms and toppled to the ground for the game-winning touchdown. And I remember the quake and the aftershocks inside that stadium, and I remember the bacchanalia outside, and I remember listening to the radio broadcast in the car, and I remember watching the highlights on the news and on television the next morning, and I remember thinking that I would never, in the course of my life, see anything bigger than that again. It's a difficult thing to quantify, the elation, the connection, the sense of belonging that college football provides. But then, maybe you don't need me to tell you. Maybe you already understand. Or maybe you don't understand at all. Maybe you attended a liberal arts college in New England, or maybe you grew up in a city where the athletes were professionals, New York, say, or Boston, or Chicago, or London. Maybe the very idea of college football resided at the far edge of your consciousness, a rural preoccupation like Garth Brooks and peanut butter parfaits and moonshine, the province of Southerners and state school graduates and scrubbed fraternity boys in hooded sweatshirts. Maybe the thought of a university's morale being tied to its football team strikes you as a fundamental failing of American society. Maybe you hear stories about corrupt recruiting and grade fixing, and maybe you cannot understand how a sport with a long history of exploitation and brutality and scandal can still be considered a vital and often defining aspect of student life. Maybe you see it as a potentially crippling frivolity, or as a populist indulgence, and maybe the threat of football encroaching on the nation's educational system makes you wonder how someone could possibly write a book, an entire book, extolling its cultural virtues. And the thing is, I would like to tell you that you're wrong, but I also know that you're not entirely wrong. I'm writing this in the fall of 2013 as college football reaches a turning point. In 2014, a 4-team playoff will commence, the most tacit acknowledgement to date from the NCAA that the sport is no longer an amateur pursuit. There are lawsuits pending as to whether college athletes will be able to trade on their name and likeness, and there are debates over whether they should be paid a stipend and whether the sport should be opened up to the free market. All of this is happening at the same time as we ponder legitimate questions about whether the sport of football is too violent to exist at all. After the Penn State child sex abuse scandal broke in 2011, I wrote some words that got circulated online, and I somehow briefly became a de facto spokesman for my hometown. In the process, I had people asking me multiple versions of the same question. Why does college football exist? It came from graduates of East Coast private schools that did not field football teams, from hardcore academics who saw college football as anathematic to their own purposes, and from writers in Brooklyn who viewed college football as a simple-minded Southern thing. So this book is an attempt to convey why college football means so much to me, and maybe to you if you grew up in a place like my hometown, or if you graduated from a school like Michigan or Ohio State or Alabama or Texas, or if you were one of the roughly 50 million Americans who attended a college football game last season. It is a cultural history and a personal history, and it's an exercise in nostalgia. It's a lamentation of the sport's enduring stubbornness and a celebration of its enduring innocence. It is a sentimental defense of college football from an obsessive fan, and it is an attempt to detail how college football's long history of scandal and politicization and bureaucratic infighting had led us to this point. It is an exploration of the very meanings that college football holds for so many otherwise rational Americans, and it is exploration of the ways that college football, in arousing such passion and such unabashed hatred, has come to reflect our national and regional identity. No other nation in the world can even fathom the notion of attaching a prominent money-making athletic operation to a university. The fact that college football has existed for nearly 150 years, and the fact that it remains one of the most popular sports in America, must say something about who we are. I grew up with college football in my blood. I am not so blinded as to fail to recognize its inherent hypocrisies, and yet I still enjoy it more purely and completely than I enjoy almost anything else in my life. I don't want it to die. I don't want it to fall victim to corruption and violence. I don't want it to wither in a courtroom due to the failures of bureaucrats. I want it to find a rational path beyond this point of crisis. I want people to understand. What follows is my attempt to explain. And so then it gets into, as John mentioned, 14 different games. And the games are really just jumping off points to get at different aspects of the sport, different arguments about the sport, different thoughts that I have about the sport, and self-indulgent memoir is in there a little bit here and there. So it kind of veers all over the place, which is kind of what college football does, I guess. It kind of veers all over the place and hopefully sort of serves as a representation, larger representation of what college football means to us. Grab my water.
Sure. So, can you discuss a little bit more about why you decided to write the book and just the process of writing it, how you landed on those 14 games, why those themes with those games?
Yeah, I mean, I think, as I said, the games were kind of a jumping off point. So the first game I write about is the Rutgers-Princeton in 1869, which was kind of the first organized college football game. And I wanted to write about the early days of the sport and just how a lot of the arguments that we were having about college football back then are the same arguments we're having today about the violence inherent in the sport and whether it demeans the purpose of a university. Because it starts in the Ivy League, so it starts with Harvard and Yale. And so you have, the president of Harvard is basically wanting to ban football. Meanwhile, you have Yale. A guy named Walter Camp kind of becomes the first modern football coach. So he, develops this apparatus at Yale, which is sort of like the first big-time college football program. And so that's kind of how the whole thing works is, it's basically like, I picked a bunch of games, some of which are considered games of the century, because college football is one of those weird sports where if you go on Wikipedia and you look up game of the century for college football, there's like 15 games of the century, which makes no logical sense, but that's part of college football, is that it doesn't make any logical sense. And so the games were just like, it was like, okay, I want to write about Notre Dame. I'm going to find a moment in history that sort of captures Notre Dame. Or I want to write about Woody Hayes. So I'm going to find a moment in time that captures kind of the essence of Woody Hayes and can, there's obviously a reason why I wanted to write all these different things, because I think they capture different aspects and elements of the sport itself.
By the way, Princeton and Rutgers played again in 1869, I recently found out, and Princeton won. Rutgers initially won, and Princeton counts that as a national championship.
Yeah, in fact, I just wrote about that today, which is crazy, right? I mean, if people are arguing about like, oh, the college football playoff system is so screwed up, you go back to 1869, you have 2 games the entire season. One team wins one and one team wins the other, and one school is claiming a national championship out of that. So it's like, this is our baseline. This is why college football is so screwed up, But it's also great.
How much research did you have to do into sort of the history of the game, and did any one piece of information, I mean, you're writing about Stagg and about Camp and all those guys, did anything surprise you?
Yeah, it was surprising just how the same themes were present throughout. So if you go back to the beginning, some of you might know that like in the early 1900s, there was this move to ban football because it was so violent, and Teddy Roosevelt got involved. And a lot of people, sort of credit Teddy Roosevelt for helping to save football because he kind of convened all the powers that be at that point, and that was when the forward pass became a thing. But you go back and you look back on it, and it's this, people are just having the same arguments over and over again. If you go back to the 1950s and 1960s, the Big Ten is trying to decide whether it wants to keep up with the SEC, and in terms of academic standards, and eventually the Big Ten decides to lower its academic standards a little bit because they want to keep pace. And it's just these same things happening over and over again. Television gets involved, and then it kind of ratchets up a little bit more. But it was just amazing to see that if you go back to the very beginning, it's just a reflection of, it's such a reflection of American culture too, because it's like the arguments that we're having about college football are basically these regionalized arguments that are sort of reflect the same arguments that we're having about politics or cultural values or all these other things.
That's really interesting. To that point about the arguments that we're having, you trace the playoff system to some degree anyway to the Notre Dame-Michigan State 10-10 tie in 1966, and the idea that afterward it was Michigan State that proposed an 8-team playoff, and here we are now with essentially a 4-team playoff after this season. Are you, as somebody who does a lot of research into this and thinks about it, are you satisfied with the playoff system? Did you like our championships mythical?
I go back and forth on that question. The funny part is so Notre Dame ties Michigan State in 1966. Notre Dame sort of plays for the tie at the end. We'll agree to disagree there, yeah. But it was a smart thing because Notre Dame wound up winning the national championship. This sort of spurred all this debate, and the Michigan State coach says, well, we should have an 18 playoff. This is in 1966. So it only took 50 years for us to get there, right? And we're still not quite all the way there yet. But I do go back and forth on it because one of the things I write in the book a lot is this idea, I call it the argument with a capital A. And it's just this notion that college football is driven by argument, and that it's an important part of the sport in a way that I don't think it is with any other sports. Because you have all these different regions and all these different schools, and there's no way that every school is ever going to get to play every other school. So you're going to have this gap where you're going to, this whole idea of like strength of schedule, we're never going to have a completely level playing field. And I wouldn't want it to be that way because I want that argument to persist, which is why I was so kind of amused and happy that when these college football playoff standings came out, everybody started freaking out like it's SEC bias, and it's like, you people are insane. But it's like, it's the best kind of insanity.
So Penn State has been involved in its share of ranking controversies over the years, very often sort of on the dissatisfied side of things. So again, as somebody who's thought deeply about these things and is as partisan as you can be, when you think about years like 68, 69, 73, 77, 94. Which is the most egregious to you? Which is the one where the Knicks have the best argument for? In retrospect, they should be number one.
Well, I'm class of '94, so I have a soft spot for that one. That offense was the best offense I think I've ever seen in my life, and I will stick to that. I still think they would have beat Nebraska. They should have played Nebraska. But I think that helped drive the BCS, which was still an imperfect system, which helped drive the playoff, which is still an imperfect system, and there never will be a perfect system. One of the other ones I read about is '69, when Richard Nixon winds up declaring the national champion. I don't know if you guys even know this story at this point, but '69, Richard Nixon decides, I'm going to appeal to Southern voters because this is my base now. So I'm going to appeal to Southern voters. And I'm going to do this by going to the Texas-Arkansas game and declaring whoever wins this game to be the national champion. And so Richard Nixon, gets all set to go down there, and then all the national media ask him, well, what about Penn State? And Penn State's undefeated at that point too. So Richard Nixon does this, winds up alienating the entire state of Pennsylvania, tries to backtrack on the whole thing. He's like, well, I didn't really declare them the national champion. I just said they were number one, And it was just this crazy thing where I loved writing those chapters about the late 60s because, the society is changing and culture's changing and it's all happening on college campuses. And so college football is like directly involved in everything that's happening in the culture at large.
And do you want to give them Joe Pa's great line?
What was the line? It was in a commencement speech, right? In 73, after Watergate, he says, how did Richard Nixon know so much about college football and so little about Watergate?
You also, continuing with the rankings theme, you talk about how the argument takes different forms at different times. So beating your opponent head-to-head can matter one year, but it can not matter the other year. And there are certain sort of we owe it to you moments that pop up over history.
Yeah, I write about the 1979 Sugar Bowl is one of my first memories. That was when Penn State lost to Alabama on this famous goal line stand. And I still think we got in the end zone on third down or whatever it was, but we didn't really, but I'd just like to say that. That was a year where that game loomed so large to me, it was like, this is the national championship game. But then you go back and look at that year, and Alabama had lost to USC. And USC also had one loss. And probably should have played for the national championship because they had beaten Alabama. But at that point, Bear Bryant was getting old, and I think there was some sympathy for him, and so he kind of politically worked his way into that national championship game. That's what's so interesting about college football is the politics are constantly being played. That's why you see these coaches always arguing for their teams or arguing against the system. You had a couple coaches come out this week and sort of arguing against this whole SEC, ESPN grand conspiracy that they seem to have in their heads. And they're just playing politics because that's part of the system in college football, and that's what makes it so interesting. And what was the original question? The original question was, I completely lost it.
Well, just how the whims of the moment.
Oh yeah, and the other one was, the other whim of the moment, I write about Nebraska in 1984, I believe. Decides to go for a two-point conversion. This is back when you couldn't play for overtime, so you either had to go for two or tie the game. And Nebraska has this play in the last minute where in the national championship game against Miami, it's the Orange Bowl, and Tom Osborne decides if he kicks the extra point there, his team would probably get the tie and win the national championship. But he decides to go for 2 points. He doesn't make the two-point conversion, and it sort of endears him to the country. And 10 years later, it's Penn State and Nebraska are both undefeated, and Osborne wins the national championship because he hadn't won one yet. Which should have been probably a shared national championship that year. But I think people felt sympathy for Tom Osborne at that point. And the funny thing was, the next year, Tom Osborne wound up winning another national championship. So it's like all these sympathies and political stuff that gets played along, half the time it doesn't even matter in the end.
And then they become a dynasty, and there's a desire to sort of see them kicked off the top of the mountain.
Right, because once people get on top, then you don't want to see them on top anymore, so yeah.
I have to ask you a tough question here. What can you describe the most bereft you were at a loss, and what that moment taught you about
Wow. That's a really good question. I wonder if my mom might be able to answer that. No, I've been, there's definitely times when I've been pretty bereft. I think a lot of those, I would say the 80s and 90s were probably the peak of things for me.
Yeah.
I think, weirdly, when Penn State lost that game to Michigan in 2005, I think it was, and it was like 1 second left and the clock operator screwed the whole thing up. That one really pissed me off. I remember I had to have dinner with my wife's parents after that game, and I just couldn't even speak. And I think I had jumped so high on that play that I had broken her ceiling fan, so she was already angry at me. And it just felt like, because that was the year that Penn State had been awful for 4 or 5 years before then, and it was like, it was just
back.
Yeah, it was this moment we're back and we're gonna, we're on the national scene, and then we couldn't beat Michigan for how long was it? It was 12 years where we just couldn't beat those bastards. And sorry, there's a whole
the next question is going to be about Michigan.
There's a whole chapter in here about Michigan, but we can transition to that if you want.
Well, I think that it sort of tells it's. The last question is more than just sort of poking fun at you. I think it sort of speaks to the largest point of the book, which is why do we care about the sport? Not to ruin the ending, but
well, I think that's part of why I wanted to write the book in the first place, was because it was I wanted to figure out why I get so insane about this stuff, and I do throughout the book. I think in the front and at the beginning, I sort of confess my biases, because I think everybody who comes into the sport has their own biases. I think that's part of it. I think is that, most of the people in this room, I assume, are Penn State fans, and so we're going to come at it from the Penn State angle, except for this one right here, but,
it's like a second marriage. It's not as hot, but we're really comfortable with each other.
That's actually a really good metaphor. I might put that in the paperback edition. But yeah, I think that's so that's part of what I was trying to get at with this book, and then I think it just gets back to with any sport, it gets back to our cultural identity and tribalism and all those sort of things that I learned in my when I was a sociology minor that I don't remember anymore. It just goes. For me, it's when I'm watching a Penn State game. I live in San Francisco now. I lived in New York for a long time. I haven't lived here in 20 years or something. But it's kind of I go back here every weekend when I'm watching those Penn State games. And when you guys graduated, it'll be the same way for you. It's wherever you're living, you will go and you will go to a bar, you'll go to your friend's house, and you'll watch these Penn State games, and it'll just be that connection to those years of college that you had here. Because my experience at Penn State was pretty positive, and I assume most of your experiences at Penn State are pretty positive. It's a pretty fun place to go to college. And so it's fun to just go back and to relive those moments, even if it's for 3 hours on a weekend, and I think that's why people feel so connected to college football. I think there's different things in different regions. If you get down into the South, where college football really is close to a religion, it really gets into the cultural identity of the South itself, and how they've felt marginalized over the years. And on all those sorts of things. So you can really get into a lot of sociological issues through college football, just because it reflects the cultural identity of the country so much.
That's a great answer. I think it's time to open it up a little bit. Let's see who's got questions. Gentleman in the back in blue.
What are your thoughts on the college football playoff committee and the assembly of it?
You mean who's on it?
Yeah.
Well, it's an interesting thing because I don't know who they were gonna get. It is pretty strange that they do have a lot of people who are still active with various schools. And I do wonder, if, for Tom Osborne, obviously, like if Nebraska comes up in the playoff, he would recuse himself. But like, what if Oklahoma or somebody were to come up in the playoff? Does Tom Osborne recuse himself because he used to play Oklahoma and they used to be his rival? Or is that okay? Where do you draw the line between like where the biases are and where the biases aren't? That's the interesting part to me. There's one guy who's a former sports writer on that panel, and he's probably the most, will probably be have the least cultural biases of anybody. But I think the rest of them, it's like, I don't know where they draw the line, where people recuse themselves. It's an interesting process, and it'll be interesting to see how it plays out, because we're just assuming, we got these people who are high integrity and they will be objective, but nobody's perfectly objective. And so when you put these, whatever it is, 12 people in a room, they're going to have their own opinions, and the idea is that the numbers and all the data that they have is going to override these opinions. But I don't know if that's the case. I have no idea if that's the case or not. So it's kind of fun in a way, because that idea of the argument is still there, No matter who these guys pick, as we saw when the first poll came out and people freaked out, people are gonna freak out regardless of who they pick. So it's just a different way of doing things, I guess. I don't know if it's a better way of doing things or not.
And 1 to 2 now becomes 4 to 5.
Right, that's the only difference really. It's like, okay, whoever the number 5 team is gonna raise hell and complain instead of who the number 3 team is, But there's still gonna be that same argument going on. And I like that it's messy, and I like that it's, it's gonna be contentious, because that's part of what the sport is.
I was wondering, was there any singular moment in your life that kind of solidified your dream to be a sports writer? Was it just one moment, or was it just a collection of kind of experiences?
Well, I would say the moment was probably moving here, because that was when, I sort of, this town is sort of taken over by football in the fall. And we moved here in August, and, it was like this giant thing. And like, when you're a kid and you go to Beaver Stadium, it just like, everything seems so huge to you, So I would say that was probably the moment where I thought, I want to do something related to sports. And then, for me, then it was like the writing kind of came along with it. And, I always tell students basically that I think the writing part, you gotta love the writing part first, and then the sports part. Just because you love sports doesn't mean you should become a sports writer. And I still think that's the case. So I think of myself generally as like as a writer, and then the sports thing is just kind of what I wind up focusing on. But yeah, I think that's probably just moving here, I think, kind of, it just solidified things for me a little bit.
Right here. How did you get your start coming out of school?
I got my start, it's a newspaper called the Akron Beacon Journal, in beautiful, picturesque Akron, Ohio. Yeah. And that was when newspapers were still in ascendance. I came over, it's kind of a weird, I feel like I graduated at a weird time. Maybe John feels this way too a little bit, where I think we're like in between almost.
Yes.
Where like we started out and the industry was something completely different,
Yeah.
and now it's something else. But yeah, that was my first job, was covering high school sports, sort of regional, county things. I would basically had 2 pages to fill each week. And my editor was basically just like, fill these with whatever you can find. So I would go like find an ultimate frisbee contest, I think. Yeah, some of it was pretty boring. But that's kind of that's how you started out back in my day. That's how you started out.
Steve?
I can't wait to read your book. One of the things that I've sort of thought about being on a university, and so I'm going to ask you a question you may not get in these sorts of things, which is to based on your stated qualifications as a sociology minor. And that is...
I think that was like 12 credits or something.
And that is, to what extent do you think it's fair to view creative nonfiction, which is generic, as I understand the genre you might call this, as a hypothesis generator for social sciences? So you make a bunch of conclusions in the book based on sort of review of his in-depth review of these 10 stories, and you've made these choices. And really, you haven't proven anything scientifically, but what you have done is raised a bunch of questions that people who have taken more than 12 hours of sociology actually could study. And that one could use your book, for example, as sort of a research design for a social science study. Is that an accurate way to think about
I mean,
creative nonfiction in general and your book in specific?
That would be very flattering if that was the case. I mean, I hope that's the case because I'm not an academic, so I'm not smart enough to design those studies or know how to even ask a lot of those questions in a scientific sort of way, which is funny because half of my family is scientists, so maybe there's like this sort of unformed scientific part of my brain. Because I think the way I look at it is I'm just riffing off of ideas and writing about ideas and thinking about ideas and throwing the questions out there and throwing my thoughts out there. And, you know, I want people to argue back at me. I want people to disagree with me or to agree with me or to, you know, just, yeah, I think the idea, and I think that's the idea for a lot of quote unquote creative nonfiction or essay writing or whatever you want to call it, at least the stuff that I like to read, is that you're just, you know, you're sort of throwing the ideas out there. And whether there's a connection with social science is something that I never really thought of before, but it's certainly, I think, you know, any of us who write this sort of stuff would find that flattering if there is any sort of connection there, if anybody could take anything away from this book that would, you know, that could do that.
If I could just offer a quick follow-up, could you think, for example, you could come up with 10 hypotheses about sport, culture, or something from that book, and then...
I hope so. I mean, I hope each chapter is a hypothesis, basically. I mean, I think that's the way that I go about writing is, you know, when you start out, you know, as a writer and as a journalist especially, I think you're kind of talking to your subjects and you're just sort of reflecting what your subjects are saying or who they are and things like that. And as I've gotten further into it, I think probably what my strength is sort of generating an idea or a thought or a notion and using you know, whatever I'm writing about to sort of advance that notion or to play with that notion, because a lot of times, you know, when I was going into writing a chapter for this book, I might have an idea of, okay, I want to write about, you know, Woody Hayes, or I want to write about, you know, the idea of why I think college football is better than pro football. So then it's like, then I'm going to sort of just toy with this idea and see where it takes me, you know. So I think there probably are those hypotheses are in there, and hopefully they're not too buried in there. And sometimes I don't even know which direction my hypothesis is going to go in. Sometimes it's just, you just go with it and see where it takes you.
Let me ask you about one thing in the book that is sort of one of these hypotheses. Can you describe to people, and you might have to give a little bit of background on the rise of the University of Miami and the sort of swagger culture of South Florida and sort of your changing viewpoint on it?
Yeah, I mean, I hated Miami when I was a kid, obviously. You know, they were Penn State's, not Penn State's rival, but, you know, the big moment for me was that '87 Fiesta Bowl when we beat Miami and had 1/10 of the talent that they did. They were loud, they were annoying. Michael Irvin's a jerk, you know, it was like all this stuff. But then I went back and, you know, I watched like that 30 for 30 documentary about them. And they're still kind of jerks, but I realized that, like, if you go back and you look at what they were doing back then, they were basically challenging the system. They were challenging the NCAA. They were saying, you know, we don't like the way this system works. We don't like the fact that you're exploiting us, you're using us. We're these poor kids, a lot of us from, you know, inner city Miami or other cities, poor black kids for the most part, and we don't like the way that this system is exploiting us. And I think that's part of what they were doing, was expressing themselves and using their public stage to show that, like, we're not gonna take this crap anymore, basically. And it was sort of like it was kind of a social protest. And I think a lot of what they did has translated into what we see today in terms of athletes challenging the system, you know, Northwestern forming a union, you know, a lot of these lawsuits against the NCAA. I think you can go back and you can trace the formative part of that to Miami just because of how demonstrative they were and just how unwilling they were to accept the way things were. And I know there was a painful moment with Notre Dame and Miami, but we won't bring
2
that
years
up.
later, it got better.
Yeah,
Actually,
that's true. Yeah, there was revenge involved.
I grew up around here too. I also graduated from Penn State in '94, so when I was reading Season of Saturdays, a lot of your experiences, you write about, completely overlap with my own, so it really spoke to me, sort of like a Chuck Klosterman book speaks to me. So I'm really curious.
Chuck was actually the best man at my wedding.
Are
so.
you serious? Wow, wow. You have similar writing styles to it. But at any rate, so I'm curious as to whether you ever wish that Penn State were not in the Big Ten, but rather in a conference with all the traditional teams we played when we were kids, like West Virginia, Pitt, Syracuse, Boston College. What do you think about that?
Lambert.
Yeah. I was talking to Steve Samsel about this earlier. Like, I want Penn State to play Pitt every year. And it frustrates me that they don't play Pitt. And I think we're playing Pitt, what, in a couple of years or something like that? 16 and something like that. Yeah, but like, that should happen every year. In a way, it's probably good that we didn't do that, because I think East Coast football is really in decline, even more so than Big Ten football is. And I think that's one of the things that, you know, I read about a little bit in the book, is what's football going to be in 20 years? Because none of us know right now. I mean, a lot of parents, especially on the East Coast or in places where football isn't emphasized, aren't going to want their kids to play it.
Mm-hmm.
I think East Coast football might be kind of in decline a little bit, and it's probably better that Penn State didn't join that. I think it would have been nice if they would have joined the ACC when you look back on it,
Well,
because,
but don't you
but
think Eastern football wouldn't be so much in decline if Penn State and Virginia Tech and West Virginia
Yeah.
stayed together?
no, it's an interesting question. Yeah, it's an interesting point, because the ACC, how many of those teams that we used to play are now in the ACC? There's like Syracuse and Pitt and a bunch of them. So that almost probably would have been a better fit for us. And what probably should have happened is they should have formed that Eastern Conference, which is what I think what Paterno always wanted, was for them to form that Eastern Conference. And then you could have expanded out from there, and it started to expand south. And it would have been essentially the ACC, except with Penn State in it. Maybe they could have roped Notre Dame into it, but I don't know.
Doubt it.
And then we'd have it biased officials in our favor, like we used to have in the '80s.
Right.
Instead of
Right, well,
Michigan and Ohio
well,
State.
no, here's, and yeah, I was talking to Steve about this too, but in terms of officiating, I watched probably 15 college football games a weekend now, maybe even more than that, you know, bits and pieces here and there. I'm flipping around for 12 hours a day. Officiating is kind of incompetent everywhere. I watch a lot of Pac-12 games, and Pac-12 officiating is terrible. So I would say, I don't think the officiating is biased, I think it's just bad. And especially Big Ten officiating is pretty bad.
This guy up in the red.
Was there a game or two that you felt you wanted to get in the book, but it didn't make the cut for it?
Yeah, there were a couple. There was a Oklahoma-Nebraska game in the 70s, like early 70s. That was kind of a big, that's one of the 85 games of the century.
That was a game of the century.
Yeah.
Johnny Rogers.
That's one of the few I didn't get in there. People are like, why didn't you get all the games of the century in there? I'm like, well, it's my book. I can do what I want. So, so that one didn't get in there. I'm trying to think. There were a couple teams that I wanted to get in there that I would have liked to talk about more. But I feel like I said, the games were kind of a jumping off point. So, for instance, like, there's a chapter about when Texas Tech beats Texas in 2008, and it's Mike Leach, and so it's talking about kind of the new college football offenses, but it's also a lot about like Steve Spurrier in Florida, because he was kind of the same thing back in the 90s. So I cheated a lot. Like, there's a lot of them where people will be like, oh, this is going to be about this game or whatever. Like even the Penn State chapter, the last chapter, I think the Fiesta Bowl is the game. The 87 Fiesta Bowl is the game, but it's really not about that game at all. Partly because I've already written a lot about that game, and partly because I just wanted it to be about something else. But that still felt like it was kind of like the jumping off point for that chapter.
That's great. You had a question?
Oh, just talking about Miami, some of the things that went on with that, some things going on in today's game. Just, with things like Todd Curley and all these things with autographs that are coming up, what are some of your opinions on that and just how that's affecting college sports?
Oh, I mean, I think we all agree that it's pretty ridiculous that he's getting suspended for this at this point, which that's good. That's a step forward because it didn't used to be that way. I don't know if you guys remember when Curtis Enos was here and he accepted a suit before one of the bowl games, and it was this huge deal, and it was like Penn State's cheating and all this stuff. How dumb does that seem now, that the guy got a suit, basically, and then it was like this, But I think people are starting to realize that, like, a lot of these NCAA rules are dumb and need to be changed, and probably will be changed, because I think the NCAA is really, really unpopular, first of all. Probably like more unpopular than Congress at this point. And they're also, part of the reason they're a terrible organization is because they're such a reactive organization. So they're just gonna react to what the public opinion is, I think. And they see now that, like, people don't want this to be the case anymore. People don't want Todd Curley to get suspended for profiting off his own name and likeness. And so I think what's going to happen, I'm hoping what's going to happen is, like, the fact that this happened to Curley, the fact that it happened to Johnny Manziel, the fact that maybe Jameis Winston did it too, we don't know. All these high-profile cases just starts to spur that change even faster. The only concern for me then is where does college football go? Like, how do we keep the character of college football and keep it different from the NFL, but also afford these guys some rights and afford them the ability to at least profit off their own name and likeness, So that's kind of where, that's the big concern for me, is like, I want to keep the spirit and the character of college football, but I also want these guys to be treated more fairly, and I think that's kind of where everybody is at this point.
This gentleman back here, waiting.
Michael, I think in November of 2011, you were sort of angry about what was happening in Happy Valley. Am I right?
Yeah, I mean, I hope a lot of people were angry,
My question is, has your anger dissipated since you were writing in November and December of that year?
That's a really tough question. I mean, I think I still get angry when I think about everything that happened, when I think about the way it happened, and I'm probably not getting angry about the same things that other people might be getting angry about. I'll probably leave it at that because I don't want to get too deep into it. But yeah, I think my anger was mostly the fact that I grew up around this university. I went to this university, and I think there were a lot of misconceptions from the outside about what Penn State was and about what State College was, and what this community is about, and that made me very angry. And then there were a lot of, let's just say, opinions from the inside or from the other side about what this scandal or this, whatever you want to call it, was about, that frankly I don't agree with, and a lot of the people who are out there now still talking about this stuff, I don't agree with a lot of their opinions as well. So I feel like I was sort of, and I feel even today, like I'm sort of kind of trapped in the middle here between those two extremes when talking about this.
How do you feel?
About which part?
What you were writing about in 2011?
Well, I mean, I think it's probably time for us to move on from a lot of that. I know there are a lot of people who don't want to move on from that. And I'm trying to be respectful of those people's opinions when I talk to them. I think, the paternal legacy is a separate thing and should be treated as a separate thing. And I think my main concern, as if you read my columns and go back then to now, my main concern has always been about the university at large and about the community at large. Those are the things that I care about the most, is the fact that this is a great university and this is a great community. And I think a lot of that got lost through everything that happened. And, and I think there were obviously a lot of mistakes made by people in charge. I don't know exactly who's at fault for those mistakes, but I think the important part is that, that the community and that the university are sort of able to move on from this.
Let me take us back to the book here. One of the things that struck me is sort of the myth-making ability of some of the pioneers and some of the greatest figures in the game that you hit on. And I'm wondering if you could maybe describe that a little bit to people who haven't read it or might not be familiar with the history, and also sort of your take on what that says about the American character as well, that from the very first days we've had these sort of showmen in the game.
Yeah, I mean, you can go back to the very beginning. I mentioned Walter Camp, who was the first coach at Yale, who sort of built Yale into this national powerhouse. Probably my favorite is Newt Rockne, in fact, because you go back and you look at Newt Rockne's story. He was, of course, the original, so not the original coach of Notre Dame, but sort of the coach who made Notre Dame what it is, and in a lot of ways made college football what it is. And there are all these stories about him and stories that he told and stories that he proliferated that aren't really true or are partially true. And you just realize that so much of college football is myth and legend, and a lot of times those legends aren't really entirely true when you go back and look at them. But that's kind of what America is too. It's like we're built on all these legends and myths that aren't exactly what we think they are. And so that was really fun to kind of go back and examine all that stuff and to realize that the whole win-win for the Gipper thing is kind of
Absolutely true.
Sure, let's leave it at that. Yeah.
Other questions? Yeah.
You talked about kind of the SEC, ESPN bias and Jimbo Fisher, stuff like that. Reminds me when Les Miles launched that campaign where he was like, well, we were undefeated in regulation, we should be in the title game, and they kind of stuck in the title game. Do you think that's a flaw of the system, or do you think that's just part of the system?
I think that's part of the system. I think the politics are part of the system. I think there's no way to get away from that. And it's sort of like in real life politics. It's like if we all were able to think objectively and logically and see through the BS, then our politics would make a lot more sense. But we're not. We're all sort of partisan in our own way. And I think what I try to do is by exposing the little part I can do is by exposing this idea of the politicization of college football and the idea of all this partisanship within that little world. Maybe it sort of serves as a mirror for the larger world, and for people to see well, college football is dysfunctional like this, and the politics of college football are dysfunctional like this because we don't think about it logically and because we don't think about it rationally, And so that was part of writing the book too, was to just get at that whole idea of how it reflects what America is.
Yeah. John?
I'm sort of conflicted about this national playoff, but you talked about the fact that people think we're getting, it's too much professionalism, and it looks like, now it's a professional sport. And one of the things I think we've lost with these 4 teams that we're focusing on is an emphasis or a spotlight on conference championships and what's going on in conferences. In fact, the committee is saying, we're not looking at conferences, we're just looking at who are the 4 best teams. And it appears like there's a good chance that 2 SEC teams get in, and maybe Notre Dame will get in, and maybe 2 conferences will be left out. I wouldn't be surprised if at least 2 conferences are left out.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, that's it.
And ironically, would it be better, and, people say, well, it's getting too big. It took us so long to get from 2 to 4 because you didn't want to get too big and put too much emphasis on it. But ironically, would it be better if we had 8 with each of the 5 teams, each of the 5 power conferences getting an automatic bid? Then you would go back and start to put more emphasis on conference champions. People would start to talk more about what's going on in the conference, because you would know at least at the end that conference was going to get their champion in.
That's a good point.
Better.
No, that's a very good point. I think that's an argument for an 18 playoff that I hadn't really heard before. And I think it makes sense because you're right. I do think like the conference races kind of go by the wayside at this point.
Yeah.
I'm sort of okay with that. I think it's partly because I grew up around here when Penn State was not in a conference. And so like the whole idea of winning a Big Ten championship, I'm sort of still at that like, who cares point, So for me, yeah, it's
Why not? I think it's a big deal.
yeah, and it probably should be, and
Yeah.
and I guess in this system, the way it is right now, it's not as much.
Right.
And it's an interesting argument. For me, the bigger argument to expand it is the fact that like I'm always for the underdog. There's a whole chapter in here about Boise State in the 2000s and everything. And like I look at a team like Marshall this year, and yeah, they haven't played anybody and all this stuff, but like they're undefeated, and like I want to see what they would do against Alabama or somebody, like I want them to be in there. I want the underdog to be in there, and I think I want that sense of possibility because that's what makes the NCAA basketball tournament so great.
I was just
too.
going to say like the NCAA basketball.
Yeah, and I think there should be a slot for the underdog in there too. And
What you could do with 8.
So I think we're agreed that we need more football.
You could say one team at least has to come from the 9.
Yeah, no, I think that's a way to do it too. Yeah, it is like people said, well, the 14 playoff it'll water down the season, but like you watched that Notre Dame Florida State game a few weeks ago. Both those teams are still in contention for the playoff at this point. That didn't ruin my enjoyment of that game one bit.
Right. Absolutely.
Yeah.
One more student question, and then we'll wrap things up, or maybe 2. We'll go here and here.
Who is the favorite person you ever interviewed?
Oh, sorry?
Who is the favorite person you have ever interviewed?
I actually have just interviewed Mike Leach, who's now the coach at Washington State, and that's the second time I've interviewed him a couple weeks ago. He's definitely by far the weirdest and most interesting football coach I've ever spoken to in my life. He'll just go off on these long tangents about Caribbean islands or Geronimo and all this weird stuff. So he's definitely one of my favorite interviews of all time. Yeah, I don't know if he's my favorite, but he's right up there. Yeah.
Yeah, in keeping with the whole idea about the importance of conference championships in a playoff system, what do you think about the idea to eventually move to like 4 super conferences, and then it would essentially be an 18 playoff because each conference championship would also determine the playoff participant?
So essentially, we've got 67 now. We go to 64 or something like that, and then.
Yeah, and then so Division I would just be those 64 teams. Is that how it would work?
I'm not sure if you might. I know Notre Dame's kind of sort of affiliated with the ACC right now.
Yeah, I don't know. I guess if that's the way it's gonna go, that's the way it's gonna go. But I still like the idea of like, there's still this like 0.00001% chance that like Akron is going to get into the playoffs somehow or something, I just like that possibility to be out there, and Akron's never gonna get into the playoff. But it's like, at least that notion is out there, and I think if they do the super conferences, then they will split off altogether from the smaller conferences, and then it will just be like these big money teams, yeah.
Great. Well, everybody, thank you for your great questions. Thanks for your attention, and let's say thanks to Michael.